She humiliated me at a party, laughing that I was nerdy and unattractive. So I refused to touch her thesis again and ended up watching her fail, lose her degree, and shatter her entire future. I'm 31 male, and for as long as I can remember, I've always been the bookish type. I've always loved reading, always had my nose buried in a book, always curious about things others found tedious. That lifelong love for words and knowledge eventually led me to earn a master's degree in literature about 5 years ago. Since then, I've worked as a technical writer for a software company. On paper, it might sound boring to some, but for me, it's work that brings genuine fulfillment. I take dense, complex information and reshape it into something people can actually understand. It's not glamorous, but it pays well, it keeps me engaged, and honestly, I enjoy it. Now enter Melissa. She's 29, and we've been in a relationship for almost 3 years. For the last year and a half, we've lived together. When we first met, she made it clear that what drew her to me was exactly that intellectual curiosity I've always carried. She said she loved that I read so much, that I could talk about anything, that I seemed to see the world in a way others didn't. She said it was attractive. But time has a way of revealing whether someone truly means those words or not. Melissa is in the final year of a master's program in public health administration. Over the past 8 months, I've essentially been her ghostwriter, tutor, and research assistant rolled into one. After long days at my own job, I'd spend hours at the table with her, breaking down dense journal articles, helping structure her thesis arguments, and digging through databases for sources. Her thesis focuses on healthcare accessibility in rural communities, and I've easily spent over 200 hours walking her through research methodologies, data interpretation, and statistical analysis that she should have mastered herself. But I didn't complain. I did it because I believe that's what a partner does. You support each other. But 2 weeks ago, everything shifted. We were at Natalie's engagement party. Natalie being Melissa's close friend. A group of people were talking about the new bookstore opening downtown. Naturally, I lit up. I started talking about a biography I'd been reading on Jonas Salk, the man who developed the polio vaccine. I was enthusiastic, probably a bit animated, but that's me. Instead of sharing my excitement, Melissa cut me down. She laughed. Not with me, but at me, and said loudly, "God, Derek reads everything. It's honestly kind of nerdy and unattractive. Like, we get it. You're smart." The room fell silent. Natalie tried to change the subject, but the damage was already done. I felt that sting in my chest. The kind you don't forget. I just smiled and said calmly, "I'll keep that in mind." But something in me shifted in that exact moment. On the drive home, I brought it up. I told her what she said was harsh. She rolled her eyes and brushed it off. "Don't be so sensitive, Derek. It was just a joke." I pointed out that calling me unattractive in front of a group of people wasn't a joke. It was public humiliation. She dismissed me again, saying sometimes I go overboard with the book stuff and that people think I'm showing off. That's when it hit me. My passions, the very things she benefited from every single day while I helped build her thesis, were suddenly embarrassing to her. So that night, when she asked me to review 20 pages of her methodology chapter, pages that needed serious restructuring, I smiled and said, "Can't tonight. I'm going to watch the game." She looked confused, even panicked, but I simply said, "You'll figure it out." And that's when my new policy began. A complete end to my academic support. No more editing sessions. No more hunting for sources. No more explaining basic statistical concepts she should have learned herself. At first, she tried to get me to slip back into old habits. She'd ask small things like, "Hey, can you just read this section quickly?" Or, "What's that website you use for peer-reviewed articles?" My response every time was calm but cutting. "Sorry. Too busy being nerdy and unattractive over here. Her thesis is due in 6 weeks. From what I can tell, she's barely 60% done, and what she has needs massive revisions. Her methodology is weak, her literature review is missing critical sources, and her data analysis is a disaster." Last night, she sat crying at the kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of printed articles. She looked at me and asked desperately, Aren't you going to help me? I picked up my book, took a bite of my sandwich and said, With what? She whispered, My thesis. I'm drowning here. I looked her in the eye and said calmly, Thought you didn't like nerdy. I'm just respecting your preferences. Am I being petty? Absolutely. Do I care? Not really, because you can't have it both ways. You can't publicly mock the very qualities you privately exploit. The fallout from my silence came faster than I expected. After I posted my story, I stuck firmly to my new rule. No more academic help. Melissa, who had grown comfortable leaning on me like a crutch, quickly began to spiral. At first, she tried to win me over with sweet gestures. Suddenly, she was cooking my favorite meals again, wearing that dress she knew I loved, flashing me smiles that carried just a hint of desperation. Every compliment seemed to end with, You're so brilliant, Derek. But when I didn't bite, she switched tactics. She asked for the login to the university library database. When I told her I no longer had it, she looked shocked. Yes, you do, she argued. But I reminded her that she had been using my alumni access this whole time because she'd lost her own password months ago. Her face went pale when she realized she'd been exposed. Her academic lifeline was gone, and with it, the safety net she'd always counted on. Next came the guilt trips. Her mother, Diana, called me one evening, her voice sweet and polished. Derek, honey, Melissa's really struggling. She says you're refusing to help with her education. I asked if Melissa had mentioned why I stopped helping. Diana said, She said you two had a small disagreement. Couldn't help but laugh. I told her the truth, that her daughter had publicly called me nerdy and unattractive for reading books, the same books and knowledge she'd been benefiting from for months. There was a long, heavy pause. Diana whispered, Oh, she didn't mention that part. Of course she didn't. But the real turning point came when Melissa held a study group at our place. 4 of her classmates showed up, including Terrence, the guy with the self-proclaimed genius IQ she loved talking about. I sat in the living room, reading, when I overheard Melissa struggling through a question about statistical analysis. They asked about regression models and confounding variables, and nobody knew what to do. Then one of them said, Your boyfriend's good with this stuff, right? Where is he? Melissa replied loudly, He's being difficult lately. I took my cue, walked into the kitchen for water, smiled at everyone, and when Terrence tried to flag me down with a question about standard deviation, I said casually, Sorry, can't help. Melissa thinks academic discussions are nerdy and unattractive. I'm trying to be less of that. The silence that followed was deafening. One girl smirked. Melissa looked like she wanted to vanish into the floor. After they left, she exploded at me. That was humiliating. I looked her dead in the eye and said, Now you know how I felt at Natalie's party. Over the next few weeks, her desperation grew. She tried manipulation online, posting vague sob stories on Instagram about how real love means support in dark times. Her friends flooded the comments with heart emojis and support, none of them knowing she had spent months exploiting me. Even Natalie, the same friend who had witnessed her mocking me at that party, called to ask if I was sabotaging Melissa's degree. I laughed. If not doing her homework for her counts as sabotage, then sure. Natalie went quiet. Things reached a new level when Melissa's thesis advisor, Dr. Harrison, showed up at our apartment. She had clearly ambushed me. Harrison said, Melissa mentioned you've been helping with her research. She's struggling with the statistics section. Would you consider reviewing her work? Just guidance. Melissa sat there with a smug look, like she'd outsmarted me. But I looked straight at Harrison and said, Isn't the thesis supposed to represent the student's own work and understanding? He nodded, looking uneasy. I continued, Melissa publicly mocked me for being too intellectual, called my interests nerdy and unattractive, and yet she wants me to use that same intellect to get her a degree. Harrison's eyebrows shot up. He turned to Melissa. Is that true? She stammered that it was taken out of context. But the damage was done. Harrison made it clear he would be reviewing her work very carefully moving forward. Melissa's panic turned into full-blown meltdown. She tried everything. Tears, begging, even threatening that if she failed, she'd have to move back in with her parents and we'd break up. I simply shrugged. That's your choice. You made this situation. She looked at me like she was seeing a stranger. Maybe she was, because the version of me who once willingly poured hours into supporting her had died the night she humiliated me in public. Soon, her parents showed up at our door, armed with pleas and even a checkbook. Dennis, her father, looked me in the eye and said, "What would it take for you to help her finish?" I laughed in his face. "Are you trying to pay me to do your daughter's homework?" They were silent, which told me everything I needed to know. They had been buying her way out of problems her entire life. When I asked point blank if they'd done this in undergrad, they couldn't answer. Melissa stormed out, her face burning with shame. But the final collapse came days before the deadline. I walked into the apartment and found her laptop smashed on the floor. Through sobs, she said she'd lost everything. 3 weeks of work, gone. She screamed. I asked if she had backed it up. She looked terrified. She hadn't, but I had. I handed her a USB drive with a backup from 2 weeks ago. She grabbed it like it was a lifeline, until she realized all the work since then was gone. And most of that work had been done by an emergency tutor she'd secretly hired with our shared credit card. "Guess you'll have to write it yourself," I said calmly. Novel concept, I know. She didn't sleep for days. The apartment was filled with the sounds of her crying, typing, and desperately guzzling energy drinks. When the deadline finally arrived, she submitted something barely coherent 13 minutes before cutoff. Days later, the results came back. She failed. Dr. Harrison's comments were brutal, questioning not only the quality but also the integrity of her work. He even asked for a meeting to discuss academic integrity policies, clearly suspicious that much of her previous submissions hadn't been hers. Melissa packed quietly and moved back with her parents. Her promising job offer was withdrawn after she admitted she wouldn't graduate on time. Her future, once so carefully constructed on the backs of other people's efforts, was now in shambles. Meanwhile, I found freedom. The apartment felt bigger without her constant anxiety hovering in the corners. I joined a local book club at the very bookstore that sparked her mockery. I met people who actually valued intelligence instead of using it. I even met someone, Sarah, a brilliant PhD candidate, who asked for book recommendations instead of rolling her eyes at them. Melissa texted me once more, saying she finally realized what she had lost. She said she was sorry, but by then the words meant nothing. Words have power, and she had used hers to humiliate me. Now she was living with the consequences of that choice. And me? I finally felt free. Free from being someone's secret homework service. Free from being mocked for the very qualities that made me who I am. Free from carrying the weight of someone who never truly respected me. Because at the end of the day, the books I read, the knowledge I carry, the curiosity that drives me, none of that is nerdy or unattractive. It's power. It's passion. And it belongs to me.